שמש דקה ומרפא בכנפיה.
We have dealt already with this question, how old was Boaz, earlier in this series. And I told you then, at the time, we'll hold this question. It will go with us while reading the text. If we were sitting now together, face to face, and I could ask you, which I'd love to do, what conclusions did you come to in your study of the book of Ruth? How old was Boaz? I'd very much like to get your answers. Answering this question is very important for how we see the whole situation, what mood, what atmosphere we feel when people talk to each other, whom we see in front of our eyes. Actually, such questions that go unconsciously with us, we should always somehow get to the front and talk about them, because they determine how we understand such a story, how we understand this book. When Boaz said to Ruth, "Blessed are you by the Lord," or for the Lord, or in front of the Lord, "My daughter, you have made this last kindness, this last mercy or grace better than the first, by not going after young men, whether low or rich. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. Everything you say I will do for you, for the whole gate of my people knows that you are a Eshet Chayil, a spiritual power woman." Twice Boaz calls Ruth "my daughter" here in these two verses. And he contrasts himself. He sees himself in contrast to the young man. So he himself must be an old man. According to the tradition of the Jewish sages for centuries, for millennia, he was old. Boaz was much older than Ruth, and that's why he can call her lovingly "my daughter." I was teaching my very first Bible studies somewhere in the southern eastern Germany some years ago. And I was asking this question, how old was Boaz? The Jewish tradition says he could only call her "my daughter" because he was quite advanced in age in comparison to her. When I was teaching there, it was a lot of people sitting in front of me, and there was one elderly woman, maybe in the age of Boaz, and she raised her hand and said, "He was 80 years old." And I looked at this lady, she could have been my mother, and I looked at her and I said, "You heard my Bible teaching." And later, after the study, she came up and said, "I did not hear what you were teaching. I was simply reading my Bible. And I was calculating." And she was taking the genealogies we have in the Bible and all kind of other data. And she came up and said, Boaz was 80 years old. I tell you this story because it's funny to have these discussions. And it's exciting. And you contradict each other. And it gets into this kind of tricky situation where somebody who could be your mother comes up and she's right. She was right at that point. Actually, Jewish tradition says that Boaz was 80 years old. From Ruth's standpoint, Boaz was undesirable because of his advanced age. He wasn't really the man she was looking for as a husband. And Boaz himself sees that his wealth, that he was a rich man and an influential man, didn't really adequately compensate for this disadvantage of his age. He admits that. Ruth and Boaz agree to marry one another in spite of her age, of his age. There was a mutual commitment and an awareness that the Lord wants to do something through them. There was a commitment to biblical standards that made them think about marriage. Before we now indignantly brush these considerations aside or off the table because they somehow confuse what we always had in mind, how we always saw this situation, how we always were taught and maybe taught this to our children, please consider one thing. The Bible always, or in the Bible, it's always older, sometimes very old men and women who brought the decisive children into this world. Just think about Adam. And you have to compare his age with the age of others in the genealogies around him to see that he was of advanced age when he brought the decisive children. Think of Noah. Think of Abraham and Sarah. And you can go throughout Scripture. I spontaneously think about Samson's parents. Think about Zechariah and Elizabeth. And how old was Joseph, the legal father of Yeshua, of Jesus? Incidentally, if Boaz was so much older than Ruth, it also makes much more sense that in the next chapter, it's explicitly mentioned that the Lord gave her, to Ruth, a pregnancy, and she bore a son.